right? So it's only that you're not allowed to do something that would be beneath the dignity of most people, that most people would look upon it and say that it's bizarre, that you're behaving in a certain way. Okay, and so now we're moving on to page Kuf Pei Vav, that you're not allowed to do anything to afflict yourself or another person. And he said that that is true, whether it's proactive in harming yourself by, let's say, doing something proactive to harm yourself, or even passively, the minias ezamaichol mishta, to deprive yourself of a certain pleasure that is available to you, is also prohibited, unless ela imkain osa b'derech tshuva, unless you're doing it as a form of penitence or self discipline. And he says, Shetzar zeh toivahu lahatzil nafsho mishachas. Because in that case, the act of deprivation, you're doing it in order to save your soul, to improve yourself spiritually, or perhaps even physically in some way. Okay. And so therefore, if you take a look at the Imrei Yaakov, he says, B'minias ezamaichol mishta, L'chol mashu hu muchrach lo la'adam im hu poresh mimenu harei chote. Anything that a person needs to sustain himself, if he withholds from himself that which he needs, he's called a sinner. Now, I can't imagine anything in society. I guess, I don't know, what would be an example? But that which is not something that he needs for his sustenance, he is allowed to abstain from. There are very few things in society today that are absolute essentials that people don't indulge themselves of. We have clothing, we have, I don't know, maybe housing, food, temperature control. Maybe, a person says, I'm going to sleep on the floor, or, but people generally, we know people generally don't do that, although there are people who do it as a form of self-flagellation. In other religions, especially in Catholicism, there is a sect of Catholics who are very much into self-flagellations, self-harm, self-affliction. Forget what it's, the Jesuits or the Muslims cut themselves also, right? So we know
that on Tisha B'Av, don't we sleep without a pillow or less of a pillow to?
Yeah, so we deprive ourselves of a less of a pillow. Yeah, that's like, that's for us Jews, that's,
right.
When tough, yeah, that's really roughing it, or one less pillow. Yeah.
Sometimes sleeping in a sukkah can be worse, depending on the temperature.
Right. That's right. That's true. That's true. Yeah, certainly. That's why most people are putter from sleeping in the sukkah in Toronto. But yeah, listen. Going to the supermarket and saying, I'm not going to buy the extra creamy variety or something. That's an act of self-deprivation for us today.
Just going to the supermarket can be punishment sometimes, depending on when you choose.
Yeah, okay. Ela imkain osa b'derech teshuva, unless you're doing it as a form of penitence. Rod salomar al avonos hayeduim lo, meaning that that you've sinned with a particular item that is within your purview. You've eaten too much chocolate cake, so that's it. No more chocolate cake or whatever it is. Avalim ein lo avonos elarotza litzar atzmo derech prishus lo uchidalakaman. But if you're not guilty of a particular sin, and you just want to afflict yourself as a form of asceticism, of abstinence, that you're not supposed to do, which is surprising because there are many sifrei musar in the medieval period that do talk about self-affliction and how sometimes sigufim, as they're known in Hebrew, flagellations are virtuous. there used to be a custom of people would roll themselves in the snow, or they would sit naked on an anthill and let the ants crawl all over them. Yeah, these are described, and what
I call that something else.
Jews used to do this, and it's actually mentioned in Sefer Orchos Tzadikim, which is a very, very old medieval sefer. And he writes there that that's not really what it's all about. But he says that it was known in his time that Jews would engage in those kinds of activities. So anyway, but based on that, v'lachein muter lihisanos l'teshuva. Afilu misha eno yachol lihisanos. And therefore, that's the reason why it's permitted to fast, even if you know that it's somewhat harmful for you to fast, because you're not a good faster. But if you're doing it in order to atone for a particular sin, you're permitted to do it. And the Imrei Yaakov says, Afilu misha eno yachol lihisanos. The Talmud Chacham shetorasu umnaso ein tzarich lesagef atzmo kol kach al ha'avonos. He says, if a person is a Talmud Chacham and he learns as his full-time occupation, he is not supposed to afflict himself through fasting. Like if you're in Kolel, you should not afflict yourself by fasting, because then you're actually exchanging one act of discipline for another, because you won't be able to learn Torah that way. But rather what he should do is he should learn more than he normally does, and that would be his way of sort of rehabilitating himself if he feels he's done something wrong. Because v'sifrei hamusar, the be'emsa achilaso ba'od shemisa v'lechol yimshach yado mimena. That the Sifrei Musar write that while you're in the middle of your meal, while you're still hungry, that's when you should abstain. In other words, don't eat to satiation. That should be our goal, is don't eat till you're full, eat till you're halfway full. And that's a form of self-discipline. This is considered to be a true type of self-discipline or self-flagellation. In other words, if you really want to show a sense of rehabilitation, that you're, I've put on a few pounds, and I know that overindulgence is wrong. It's considered to be a sin in Judaism to overindulge. So then the way that you rehabilitate yourself is to stop eating in the middle when you know that you still have plenty of room for more. Okay, and that's actually very hard to do. It's very, very hard to do. Okay. Uvi Igeres Agra, Joby, you're happy about that, right?
Self-motivation. Sort of negative things your body, and discipline, which basically tell the brain to tell the body what to do.
Right.
Against what we call normal things like eating.
Yeah.
Which is a hard thing to do, but I think that's the goal, is to control the body.
Right. Joby's saying that the goal is for the brain to control the body, and not the impulses to control the body. Yeah. Okay. Right. Leave over a third? My mother would call that a crime. Right.
Actually, I know you said that in jest, Rabbi, but I don't know how this sort of balances with food, like the avera to waste food. I don't know it's avera, but you shouldn't waste food.
There is a prohibition of bal tashchis, right? So probably what's best to do, my wife portions out my food for dinner, and I always tell her, give me a little bit less, always a little bit less. Mm-hmm. But sometimes she loves me, she wants me to be happy, and so I generally will leave over something, if I feel she's put too much food on my plate, and then I don't touch it, so then she knows to put it away for the next meal. So that would be one way of doing it.
And the aspect of, you can always go back for seconds if you go, and then restrain yourself from doing that if the portions are right. I guess that's where, rather than throwing out what's on your plate, just not going back to get more if what you
Right.
took in the first place was the right
That's
amount.
right. That's right. That's right.
There's also a concept that the body takes a little bit of time to catch up to the hunger. So in other words,
Yeah.
Once
Right.
it settles in your stomach, you're might be more
Yeah.
full.
Eat slowly. Eat slowly. Yeah. Exactly. So this was actually on social media. I was noting that they just had the Agudas Yisrael convention. They usually have it over the American Thanksgiving weekend. And apparently, I don't know exactly the details, but apparently one of the rabbis got up and was lambasting the excesses of what's going on in that Agudas Yisrael, Haredi world. And they talked about the meat boards. That's the latest, the charcuterie boards. It's the latest excessive indulgence. That if you don't have a charcuterie board at your simcha, then you're nobody. Oh, that's and so, but it's important because thank God there's a lot of wealth in the religious community, and we have to make sure that we don't use that wealth incorrectly. Okay. Uvigeras hagra isa demisha mirasein pivita avaso zehu tshuva. In the epistle of the Vilna Gaon, he writes that a person who muzzles his mouth and his urges is doing the real form of tshuva. And we go to the next page. It's actually better than all types of fasting and self-flagellation. Is just to muzzle your mouth at a time when you're still hungry and just say ginik. That's it. The chol rega v'rega sha'adam chosein piv, and as long during that time when a person is muzzling his mouth, zocha bishvilo loor haganuz she'ein malachu bria yacholim l'sha'er. He merits to have an amazing spiritual light rest upon him that no angel or no other creature can possibly estimate the tremendous spiritual light that falls on someone who is able to restrain themselves for going for seconds, as Paul said, or finishing everything on their plate. Okay? So, let's see. Let me see what this... Okay. So the Biurim brings a shaila from the Ri Migash. The Ri Migash was the Rebbe of the Rambam. So this goes back a long way. And he writes, there's a tshuva that he writes as follows, and it's back on page Kuf Pevav. He says, Reuven ratza lalos la'eretz Yisrael. Reuven wanted to make aliyah. Benadar shelo yochal basar v'lo yishta yayin ad sheyala la'eretz Yisrael. Chutz mishabatot v'yamim tov. And he took the following vow, or the following pledge. What do you call it? A resolution. He made the following resolution. He says, I'm not going, this is the time of year Moshe was just telling me, you have people who make New Year's resolutions in order to convince themselves or exhort themselves to do the right thing. So he says, he made a vow that he would not eat meat or drink wine until he made aliyah, except on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Yoreinu Rabbeinu im Reuven ze ovar bihiyoso noder. So the question that was asked of the Ri Migash, has Reuven committed a sin by depriving himself of meat and wine? Is that considered sinful? So tshuva, so the Ri Migash responds and he says, Misha no darzeh over al divrei Torah. He says someone who makes such a vow of abstinence is violating the Torah. B'chol yom shehu omed b'gidro hu ober b'chotei nafsho. And every day that goes by that he continues to deprive himself, he's considered a sinner. The Torah does not grant permission to afflict yourself. There's no difference between one who deprives himself versus one who deprives another. Just like it would be wrong for me to deprive you of some benefit It would be wrong to deprive myself of a benefit. V'chavar amru chazal, b'ameh she'amar hakasuv b'nazir v'chiper alav me'asher chata al hanefesh. So the Torah, actually, I mean, our sages make note of this, because when a Nazir completes, there's a passage about a Nazir who violated his Nazirism inadvertently. He has to bring a carbon and he atones for his sin. And so the Talmud says it's not the sin of violating your Nazirism that he's atoning for, but rather it's the sin of accepting Nazirism upon yourself in the first place. That a Nazir is called a sinner just by dint of the fact that he took a vow of abstinence not to drink wine. That's considered a sin. Considered a sin. V'im nikra chote mishemisir atzma me'ayayin bilvad, kol shekein sheyikra chote mishu hu mitzaer atzma min hayayin min habasar. And if a person is called a sinner by just abstaining from wine, then surely he's a sinner if he abstains from wine and meat. V'haroi sheyishal b'ned dezelecha chamumche v'yatir lo, o legimel talmidei chachavim v'afal gav de'ena mumchim. So therefore, the Rimigash advocates that this person should get some kind of annulment of his vow. And the way that he can receive an annulment is by expressing remorse to the Beis Din that will grant him an annulment. You can't just get an annulment for no reason. You have to explain why you regret having taken the vow. So what expression of regret is he supposed to make? Had I known that the Torah does not sanction this kind of vow of abstinence, I never would have taken it. And then he'll be able to get a Beis Din to annul his vow. So that's the tshuva. Ulanias daiti hapuuta lo zachisi lamud al dato hagdola b'davar zeh. So Rav Stern just writes, even though we're dealing with the Rimigash, who is a master's master. He's the Rambam's Rebbe. So you know that he was a great Rosh Yeshiva going back to the 11th century. So how can we challenge him? But he says, I don't really understand how the Rimigash can write what we just quoted him. He says, "Demistimas dvarav mashma she'ein nafkamina im habasar v'yayin nidrash v'hechrichi avuro olo." He says because it doesn't. The question does not indicate whether meat and wine are considered essential staples for this person or not. Like let's say a guy could get by very well with eating Impossible burgers or and being vegan his entire life. I mean, today there's a whole industry that you can get by without eating meat. It might even be considered healthier in today's world, right? So why is it so bad to say that I'm not going to eat meat and drink wine? Well, that's the question. Was it a staple or was it a delicacy? It's not clear. And if it was a delicacy, then what's wrong with abstaining from it? It's not something that is essential to his diet. That's really what Rabbi Stern is asking. And he writes, the Rimigash wrote that, what he's done is a biblical prohibition by depriving himself. And it doesn't seem to make sense why a person is not permitted to deprive himself of some luxury. He says, and therefore this really requires a little bit of further analysis. He says, because if you look at the Tur in Orach Chaim Siman Tav Kuf Ayin Aleph, he writes, "The Hayoshev b'tainis imatzi l'tzar nafshe nikra kadosh, v'ilo matzi l'tzar nafshe nikre chote." There's a very interesting language in the Tur. The Tur says that if a person is fasting, if he has the ability to afflict his soul, he's called holy through that fasting. But if he's not able to afflict his soul, he's called a sinner. Now, what that means is not really clear. If what it means is that if he's able to tolerate the fast and not damage his health through fasting, then he's considered a holy person. But if his body is not strong enough to tolerate fasting, and he actually causes himself injury through fasting. Some people, if they fast What can happen with your electrolytes, or it can affect your heart potentially. It could affect.
One healthy people can do very well, but people are not healthy, or they have medical issues. It can, dehydration and electrolyte issues, sugar issues, blood pressure issues, all those.
Right, there's a lot of things that could be triggered potentially if a person is not fully healthy, or maybe a person's in a more advanced age or something, right? So, uvesefer mesilas yashar and perik yud gimel herich be'inyan hanal. And the book Mesilas Yesharim, which many of us are familiar with, it's a famous Musar sefer from the Ramchal. He expands on this idea. Vehevi kama ma'amore chazal hasosim lechora atzmam. And he brings a number of statements by our sages that seem to be contradictory, which some of them suggest that self-deprivation is a virtue, and some of them suggest that self-deprivation is sinful. And the way that he's able to reconcile them in the final analysis, he states as follows. So you have the general rule that anything that is not essential for a person's sustenance in this world, then it's considered virtuous for him to abstain from those things. But if something is essential for his diet or for his other sustenance, clothing or whatever it is, like in other words, you need a coat in the winter. To deprive yourself of a coat because you want to tough it out, that's considered sinful, right? Right? It's not only stupid, it's sinful, right? It's, in other words, you're committing an avera. Kevin shuhu muchrach lo imu porish mimenu areze chata. That you've committed a sin. Hineza klal ne'eman ad kan l'shana. So the Ramchal basically says that that's your rule of thumb. Your rule of thumb is that if you don't need it and it's considered to be something that you enjoy and you want to be a person of virtue to deprive yourself of it, knock yourself out by all means. If it's essential for your health or for your sustenance, then you're sinful if you deprive yourself of it. So he says, "Harei mevur mehanal di'im habasar v'hayayin eino hechrechilo ve'eino mazik libriuso al yedei miniyasam ein bazeh shum chet." So you see that if meat and wine are not essential to your diet, the doctor says you'll get enough iron, you'll get enough calcium if you eat other foods other than meat. And you'll get enough tannins and what are the other things in red wine that are good for you? I don't know. You'll get enough sugar and other things that your body needs without drinking wine. So then it's not considered sinful. So and just to the contrary, it's considered a virtue to deprive yourself of these things at least during the week when it's not Shabbos and Yontif. Ulam afilu heicha shuhu zakuk lebasar v'yayin l'chizagufo akati yesh ladun bazeh kidalahalan. He says, and even when the meat and wine, it's arguable that you do need them for your sustenance, there is still room to deliberate, maybe even in that situation where you feel, as we'll explain in just a moment, that you feel the deprivation is to your benefit. So like in the example that the Rimigash was given, where a guy wants to make sure that he makes aliyah, so he promises himself, I'm not going to eat meat or drink wine during the week until I make aliyah, right? So, that would be a great thing to do today, even, Shehu hanidon shel Rimigash. He says, and that's the case that the Rimigash was dealing with. He says, Dihinei kaimelan barachaimis mireish mem chesif dalid, de ha'ola la'eretz Yisrael im nizdamen lo shayar afilu be'erev Shabbos, kaven de dvar mitzvah hu yachol lifrosh erev Shabbos. He says the Shulchan Aruch paskins that even though you're not supposed to embark on a journey on erev Shabbos, nonetheless, if there is a journey that is embarking to Eretz Yisrael, a caravan that's leaving Eretz Yisrael on Erev Shabbos, you're allowed to get on that You're allowed to join the caravan. So important. Now, it's not giving you license to violate Shabbos, but it's allowing you to put yourself in a situation where you might have to violate Shabbos if there's an emergency or something like that along the road. So he says,
that almost sounds, Rabbi, a little bit like what we learned in SCP about purchasing a house on Shabbos. Or
that's right.
taking steps.
That's right. Right. You're allowed to sometimes circumvent certain rabbinical laws in order to be able to fulfill the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. That's yeah, exactly. Very good, Paul. The kaven the avur etzem aliyah Eretz Yisrael vaday pashat the yesh mitzvah lalos. So certainly we know that there is a mitzvah of aliyah. And by the way, I did not write this script, even though many of you know that I speak about this mitzvah. But you see, it's right here in black and white. He says, we know that since there is a mitzvah in the Torah, to live in Eretz Yisrael, af sheyodea dal yedei zehu lo yuchal le'echol basar v'lishtos yain b'derech aliyaso, u'chumo shehaya b'meshach kol hadoros, she'al yedei tiltul haderech nimna meha'olim gam dvarim hechrechiyim. And we know that many people in prior generations, in the course of making aliyah, had to live with situations of privation. In other words, people, when they made aliyah, lived without meat, lived without wine, because their things were, basic things like that were simply not available in the medieval Eretz Yisrael. People really were moser nefesh. You know, today people are reluctant to move to Eretz Yisrael because they can't get their favorite brand of peanut butter, right? I mean, think about what it was really like, when the sacrifices that people made to fulfill the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael back in the day. So it would seem to me, he says, that if a person wishes to take a vow of abstinence from meat and wine so that he can exhort himself to make aliyah faster, then there should be nothing wrong with it. And this is true about any mitzvah, even a rabbinic mitzvah that you want to encourage yourself to do. You're allowed to deprive certain things from yourself. And even if you just want to fulfill a hiddur mitzvah, like you say to yourself, I'm not going to eat dinner until I learn for 2 hours with my chavrusa, or whatever kind of deal you want to make with yourself, so that you exhort yourself to do what you feel is important. He says that I feel is also perfectly appropriate. Sorry, I went back. Nami, the time of the milsa mishum daha asr la adam latzar asmos gufo b'dvarim ha'achrechiyim, anu dafke kishu osazos rak l'shem sigu v'derech prishus levad. He says, and the reason why this is okay is because when the rabbis forbid you from afflicting your body, right, it's only when you are doing so without any constructive purpose other than asceticism qua asceticism. You're doing it just because you want to afflict yourself, because you don't like yourself, or you want to show yourself who's boss, right? Al divrei, like the Taz writes in the Shulchan Aruch, that if you're not healthy enough to fast and you take a voluntary fast upon yourself, you're a sinner. But if the purpose of the deprivation is to fulfill a mitzvah, is to encourage yourself to do a mitzvah, we never find that it is usur at all. And he goes on and on this topic. I don't think we're going to finish it all today, but I just wanted to point out that there are many times when a person taking a vow of, not really a vow, but a pledge, because he should say b'li neder, so that he doesn't violate the obligation of not swearing falsely. But he should say b'li neder, I'm going to not eat certain foods, or I'm not going to indulge in certain enjoyable activities until I fulfill this mitzvah, or I do what I feel I need to do. That is considered a virtue, even if it may be something that some other people would consider an essential item in your diet. Okay, so that's about it for today. All right.